Welcome back to Brain Chatter, where we listen past the daily noise and explore topics at the intersection of leadership, workplace culture, profit, and sustainability. I'm your host, Derek Brown. This episode's guest is Anthony Orlowski. He is Executive Vice President of the Plumbing Group Division of McWane Incorporated. In that role, he has overall responsibility of Texas-based Tyler Pipe and Coupling plants and the Sri City, India coupling plant. At the time of this episode's recording, Anthony was then General Manager of M&H Valve in Anniston, Alabama, and VP of McWane, Inc. Since the recording of this episode, Anthony and Dr. Ken Chapman completed and released their book, Safety Beyond the Numbers. You can learn more about this online at safepath.solutions. Now, back to the original recording. Today, our topic is telling the correct story is critical to workplace safety. This is where Anthony describes workplace safety as beginning. At first, it may sound like a peculiar place to start with a safety program in a workplace. Normally, people might think that safety starts with wear your safety glasses and hard hat, don't walk in front of moving equipment, make sure your ladder is secured, and more practical commandments like that. But this is a higher plane topic of strategy and good judgment. Anthony, you've introduced it to managers, engineers, shop technicians, maintenance and operations staffs, and everyone in your organization over time. Introduce it to us too, if you will.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And first off, there's certainly value in issuing commandments, as you put it, in safety. They do play an important role. Now, we typically call them safety procedures, but I actually like your term better. It describes more accurately their real effect and intent and even potential drawbacks. I think that most safety efforts appear to be about what the company wants than what you want. We want you to do this. It's almost like we're saying that safety is important to the company, but it really has little to do with what you want as an individual. And in that sense, they are like commandments, but that is absolutely wrong.
Well, please say more about why that's wrong and what you do to make the issue of safety more about me as the individual and less about procedure and what the company and management wants.
Well, safety is undeniably important to the company. It's important from a self-interest standpoint. There's no doubt that a good safety record helps a company and a bad one hurts it. It's also important from a moral standpoint. No good company can be ambivalent to the well-being of its employees. But even though it's important to the company, those are small issues compared to the importance of safety to the individual. And when a company communicates that safety is its responsibility, either explicitly or implicitly, then people tend to believe it, and they tend to believe it to the exclusion of their own responsibility. Rules are important, but so is individual behavior.
Well, that's certainly a very attention-grabbing topic, but why is that so commonly a misnomer?
And that's where telling the correct story comes in. There's incredible value in telling the correct story, both to yourself and to others. It's really the first step in owning your responsibility for safety, both as a leader and as an individual. I was first introduced to this concept by Dr. Ken Chapman, and he illustrated it for me using the example of General Hal Moore, who led the 7th Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam. And I can summarize that example for you here. General Moore and his troops were surrounded by the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and they were surrounded because the cavalry at that time rode helicopters instead of horses, and they dropped unknowingly into the middle of an enemy stronghold, and they were outnumbered by about 3-1. The ensuing battle waged constantly for a few days, and in order to survive, he had to continually gather the best intel he could in each moment. Imperfect and incomplete as it was, but he had to have the best available. So he used information from multiple sources, what he gathered himself, from observers he sent out, and what was radioed back from the perimeter. And then he had to use his best judgment to make good decisions to keep himself and his troops alive as the battle raged on. Now, he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to tell himself a story that was worse than it really was, taking the counsel of his fears, so to speak. That would have led to him giving up and surrendering and making them all prisoners of war. He also couldn't afford to tell a story that was better than it really was. using the power of positive thinking, as they say, to believe everything was going to work out okay. If he had done that, he might have gotten massacred. And coincidentally and ironically, that's what happened to the original 7th Cavalry that was commanded by General George Custer. So to get his team out alive, he had to tell himself the correct story.
Well, a real life illustration like that is certainly very engaging, but how do you translate such a major life or death example like that to the routine daily workplace, particularly in a manufacturing facility?
It doesn't have to be a life or death situation to get real benefit from telling the correct story. It also helps tremendously in solving some of the more common issues that can bog some leaders down. I'll give you a simple example, a hypothetical situation that many people can probably relate to. Say you're in a manufacturing environment and a forklift driver picks up an unbalanced load, and as they're transporting it, it topples and falls and damages some equipment. Now, obviously, someone could have been seriously hurt here. And when you investigate it, you ask the driver, what happened? And they tell you, well, I guess I just got in a hurry and forgot what I was supposed to do. Okay, so you do some investigation and checking up, you see that the driver has been formally trained twice annually on safe driving techniques over multiple years. And they've also had several pre-shift safety meetings on the same subject. So the story that they forgot just doesn't sound right. But then you think, well, I guess it's possible. Who am I to say?
So, what do you do in that case? Whether you're a manager or the general manager, that's what has been your experience with the best way to handle that?
Well, it depends on what story you accept. So if you accept that story, then you end up retraining them based on their ignorance of the proper procedures. That's the only logical course of action with someone who doesn't remember what to do. But your solution isn't effective if you do that. It doesn't do anything to fix the real issue, which is bad behavior. And not only doesn't it fix it, it reinforces the problem behavior. It communicates that taking shortcuts and then lying about it works out just fine around here. And it goes even further, it does more harm than just that. It also communicates to everyone else that you're willing to suspend disbelief to avoid an uncomfortable situation, that you'll buy almost any story. And remember that other team members see the same things that you do. They know the real story or the correct story as well as you do. So when they see and accept an incorrect story and a fabricated one at that, you lose credibility with the team. They lose confidence that they can rely on you to make the right decision and do the right thing. And when they see this lack of leadership, it feels like no one's in charge. So they all feel like they're a bit on their own. That makes them start to wonder, what does having a leader like this mean for them? What is this guy or gal going to lead me into? And the answer to that question is pretty clear, and it's a bad one for morale.
Hmm. So, can you provide a contrasting example that's maybe a real life example of how such a situation should be handled?
Yes, I can. I think I've got a very good example, although I wasn't personally involved in it. Um, one of my senior managers once was called by a peer from a sister company, and they wanted to hire someone who had previously worked for us. The person that they wanted to hire, we had terminated for cause for a serious breach of company policy. And the caller really didn't have any questions about the person or the event. It was more a series of comments and statements. They were saying things like, well, what happened at your place isn't capable of happening at our facility. We have controls in place to prevent this that you don't have. Our standards are higher than yours, and so on and so on. So my manager listened patiently to all these statements for a few minutes, and then he finally interrupted and he said, "Well, here's the correct story. You know what this person did was wrong. You also know that if they were willing to do it here, they'll be just as willing to do it there. You know that hiring this person is the wrong decision, but your boss wants to hire them. He wants you to rationalize it and tell him it's okay, but you know it's not. That's the correct story."
Oh, wow. So, what was the response of the other person, or was that just sort of the end of the story? Because I'm guessing a response like that um, certainly brings a sobering dose of clarity and reality to a conversation real quick.
Yeah, it does. It rips away all pretense. After that, everyone had to own up to their true motives. Um, as you might expect, this made the person on the other end of the line somewhat angry, and it put an end to the call, actually. But most important, they also made the right decision. They didn't hire this individual. So I'd like to ask you, why do you think that was?
Uh, well, I would guess I would guess that it made them mad because, well, when any of us are confronted with accountability that's true, that's tied to truth, when we're attempting to take shortcuts or talk ourselves into something we know is not the right thing to do, that's pretty embarrassing, I think. And I also think that most of us want to think that we make good decisions, um, and are tied to truth. So if someone helps us see that we're not maintaining high standards, we probably get a little mad. And my guess would be first, maybe at the other person, but really ultimately mad at ourselves.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when you just brought up another good point, I'd abbreviated my manager's response. They knew each other very well. So his full statement to him was, he said the other person's name. You know I love you, but here's the correct story. So his response to him wasn't malicious or meant to put him down. It was said to help him.
And that sounds very reasonable and that sounds very fair. So I think then it's reasonable for me to ask, why is that not more widely adopted as a norm in situations like this, do you think?
Well, I think you can begin to see why it is effective and it is reasonable, but it's not easy. Most people would probably be willing to tell the correct story when they're surrounded during wartime, but there's a cost to it, and you have to be willing to pay those costs under less dire circumstances than that. When I envision this process, I see it as climbing a ladder, and there are multiple rungs to that ladder that have to be climbed to arrive at the correct story, and each requires some measure of effort and moral courage. The first rung that you have to grab onto is having standards, having some expectation. That might sound odd, but if you don't have standards, it doesn't really matter what the story is. I've done a lot of interviews with potential managers and supervisors in my career, and one thing that I always ask them is to describe an instance of a tough situation and how they handled it. Now, I'm looking not just for a glimpse of their judgment in that question, but I'm also looking to see if they have any standards.
So what do you normally find when you ask that question? Is there a particular set of insights that you expect to see from that?
There is, but unfortunately, too often I find that I'm disappointed. Um, I'm surprised, and you might be too, to learn how many aspiring managers have no real standards or expectations. They don't seem to have strong opinions on how the things that they're going to be responsible for should be. The problem with managers like these is that they don't want to exercise any judgment. They look for a company rule to tell them what to do in a given situation. If an employee does this, company policy says I should respond like that. Now, in some cases, it's possible they truly don't have the capacity or the judgment to make the right decision, but more often, the bigger problem is they're trying to avoid the burden of judgment.
Wow. So, well, and actually define that, if you will. When you say burden of judgment, what exactly do you mean?
The burden of judgment is having the courage to make a decision that has real consequences and accepting that you might be wrong or that others won't agree with you. I call it a burden because for those who avoid it, it is a burden, but really it's a responsibility. And that's the second rung of the ladder, accepting that responsibility. Now, going back to the original example, General Moore didn't have perfect information. He couldn't, but he still needed to make good decisions. And that's the way it almost always is. And that's why there'll always be a need for strong leaders, whether in business or in war or in any other significant endeavor. There's always a need for people who can courageously exercise good judgment, giving incomplete and imperfect information. But many managers want perfect information so their decisions is beyond question. No judgment required. Or in the absence of that, they want perfect process so they know the exact company policy to apply to the situation. And barring either of those, they do nothing. But that isn't what leaders are paid to do. They're paid to act. The final rung of the ladder is to have the moral courage to act on that story, even if it's a tough story to hear. And all those steps are the reason that this powerful tool isn't used more often. They each require some level of fortitude. In dire need, yes, but not often enough on the important issues of everyday life.
So, what about a scenario where a leader tries to tell themselves the correct story and they act accordingly in good conscience, but in the end, the story they tell themselves ends up being not correct? So, let's say no one is harmed, but it's still a mistake, and maybe it's even an expensive mistake for the company. How should that person's manager respond knowing that the leader they acted in good faith, they followed a logical path, but they still reached the wrong conclusion?
Well, that's a really good question because it happens all the time. People make mistakes, even the best do. But first off, I just want to state that just because a decision doesn't work out doesn't make it a bad one. You can make 100% the right decision given the information that you have available and it not work out. There's no mistake there. But sometimes you do make a bad decision. The information's there, but you exercise poor judgment. And I'm not talking again about making the wrong decision because you wanted to do the wrong thing. Bad behavior, especially out of a leader, has to be dealt with swiftly and decisively by a manager. But I'm talking about because you lack experience and your judgment wasn't sufficiently developed to meet the occasion. So in that case, a good manager will review with the person what they did right and what they did wrong, and they'll give them the opportunity to learn from their mistake and gain from that experience. So that's a key point. Just because you've been through something doesn't mean that now you're experienced. You gain experience only when you learn from it. A good indication someone has learned from their failure is when they don't make excuses for it. That's when they can truly own it. Then it's not a negative because now they possess better judgment than they had before. So a good manager makes the report stronger by letting them err and then grow to experience and learn, to say it another way. No great leader was born automatically knowing what to do in every situation. The best of them were tested under fire, failed sometimes, and then learned from that. And before we leave this subject, though, I'd like to make one last point about failure. We've been talking about it from the reference point of their manager, but how does a team respond to a leader's failure? That my experience is that a team will forgive a leader who makes mistakes too, but only in certain cases. A team will forgive a leader's failure if they listen to their people, admit the failure, and then demonstrate that they've learned from it. And really, it's identical to what their manager wants from them. Uh, People want a leader they can count on, not someone who's perfect, and they want to know that they're being heard. No single person knows everything, and to truly get the best information, you have to draw from everyone. General Moore couldn't see what was happening at all points on the battlefield. He had to rely heavily on the feedback from his men. Then he had to execute good decisions and recover from the bad ones. And that's why his men had confidence in him.
So I've seen a situation where when there was a mistake, the manager was very quick to point out whose mistake it was and to make sure that everybody knew that it wasn't the manager's mistake, it was this person, and sort of embarrass them in front of their peers. What do you think is the long-term impact of those two approaches?
Well, it's bad morale and an organization that tries to cover its backside rather than learning and growing. When there's a mistake and you're a leader, you have really two choices. You can either punish your team, or you can allow your team to learn from it and grow and be stronger. Regardless, the failure is your as a leader is still your responsibility either way.
Let me go back and do an introduction of you and your background for those listening. Anthony, you have 25 years in leadership roles at multiple facilities in heavy industry, and you've previously served as an engineering consultant too. Your education and certifications include 2 engineering degrees, a registered PE that's currently inactive, and a master's in business administration. You've also published technical articles on engineering and industrial safety. Your focus, as could be figured out from today's podcast, is heavily on building strong teams and durable performance cultures in the organizations that you've worked in and led. You've seen work and safety from a lot of different angles over the years as you've grown in your career. So, from all your experience, can you share an example from your work life? It can either be safety related or outside of safety, where you perhaps told yourself an incorrect story in the past, but came to realize it over time and was able to self correct as a result.
Yes, absolutely. And I make a lot of mistakes, and I'm always trying to learn from my mistakes. And one of those is a story I used to tell myself that was wrong, was that as the facility leader, that I could keep my people safe, that I could. I thought that if I worked hard enough, I could eliminate every hazard in the facility and that I could write safety rules that covered every situation that might come up. But even then, I didn't really believe the story that I was telling myself. Uh, uh, I was constantly worried about what was going to happen. I feared that some large catastrophe was always just around the corner. Now I tell myself the correct story, and our safety is much better, and it's better for me as well because I don't worry as much. And that story is that I'm responsible to my team for many things, but only they can be responsible for their own safety. If I suggest to them otherwise, I'm doing them a huge disservice. I'm denying them their best chance to keep themselves safe, which is to use their own good judgment, not mine. And I don't worry as much now because now I know better where my issues are. I know who's likely to make bad decisions and who I need to work with. I think worry is the result of not feeling like you have enough control over what's going to happen. And this approach, being more realistic and effective, gives me more control.
Well, in addition to filtering your workforce for people with good judgment, as you've described, how else do you seek to instill the telling of correct stories into the workplace culture when you're a leader? And what has worked most effectively in your observation over time?
That's a good question. And fortunately, it's pretty clear in my experience. What I found to be most effective with people is telling them exactly how I see them, both the good and the bad. And I do it in a constructive way, not to punish or embarrass them, but to give them feedback that's important for them to hear. I think most people have a very high opinion of themselves. The way they see themselves and the way they want others to see them is how they are at the highest end of their behavior. But everyone feels a tug now and then to behave in ways that don't align with that higher view of themselves. So, uh, and some people make quite a career of seeing themselves one way and acting another, assuming that people won't risk the confrontation with them by pointing it out. So I make sure that I tell my people how I see them and how their teammates also likely see them. And when you do that, you strip away their cover. You force them to own their actions. I found that there are a lot of people willing to act in some very unbecoming ways, but there's far fewer of them that are willing to be associated with that behavior.
Hmm.
And yeah, and that's how you use people's high opinion of themselves to their and your advantage. You be honest, being honest with them, and that's essential to building a strong culture. When it's done constructively and compassionately, then they start being honest with you too. They start giving you feedback, and that's the way that a team grows together.
Wow. Part of the theme of Brain Chatter podcast is understanding how leaders can hear through all the daily noise that comes their way, find what's relevant, dismiss what is not. That can mean the barrage of emails, personal conversations, corporate dictates, vendor communications, and so much more. So, how do you control for all the noise and find that information that is most important for good decision making on a daily basis?
I think there are a few things a leader can do that are more important than being objective and fair, and that's the place to start. You need to ask yourself, well, what's the right thing for the company to do here? How will this affect the different stakeholders? If you focus on that, then the information that helps answer those questions will quickly rise to the top, and information that doesn't pertain to them will be discarded just as quickly. You can sort through this way what's useful and relevant pretty quickly. It's like sorting through a deck of playing cards face up. You keep what you want and throw off what you don't, and you don't have to make many decisions doing that. It all goes back to our conversation about the need for leaders to have strong expectations and standards. If you're clear on what you're about, you'll see the noise for what it is, and if you're not, then the wind will just blow you whichever way it will.
We've covered a lot of ground in our conversation, but what have I missed? What else would you like to add?
Derek, we have, and I don't think you've missed much, if anything at all. You've had very good questions. But if I could leave the audience with one thing, it would be this: that as an organization's leader, you have tremendous influence. Your actions impact the lives of many people. And when we're talking about safety, That impact may be life or death, or at a minimum, a decent quality of life. Many of the things that we've discussed today, people are not comfortable doing. It's easy to decide that you'd rather not do them, to rationalize reasons not to have these conversations. But I'd ask listeners as leaders to appreciate that very significant responsibility they have, and to realize when deciding if you prefer to do or not do something that that's not the point, that when it comes to safety, it's just not about you.
Brain Chatter is a production of Ken Chapman and Associates Incorporated. We assist clients across North America and beyond with leadership development, corporate culture transformation initiatives, behavior-based professional development for health and safety issues, individual and team assessments, conflict and performance management, succession planning, and team building. Making a difference in organizations and individuals' lives for over 40 years. Learn more at leaderscode.com.